Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast, and thank you for joining me for folks' favorite Fandom Friday. Now, on these Fridays, I get the chance to visit with somebody from the wider world of the Tolkien fandom. Writers, musicians, artists, craftsmen, scholars, content creators, and a whole lot more. Now, today's guest is, well, it's fair to say she's a lot more than just a Tolkien fan. In fact, she freely confesses she's no expert on Tolkien. Instead, I've asked her here today because of her expertise on one of the other Inklings that we've been talking about lately, Charles Williams. Now, my guest is a writer, scholar, and a freelance consulting editor. She also edited The Inklings and King Arthur, which won the 2018 Mythopoeic Scholarship Award winner for Inklings Studies. For more on that, check out our episode of the Prancing Pony podcast where we interviewed her. That would be number 102. But in the meantime, folks, please join me in welcoming Sørina Higgins to today's Tolkien Times.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here to talk with you, Alan.
I'm glad to have you here. It's going to be great. So I've only recently begun to talk about the other members of the Inklings on my Tolkien Tuesday episodes. Not last series, but series 5. And Charles Williams didn't come up until the very last week of that series. But I'm back in Carpenter's book on the Inklings, and I thought it would be good to ask you to shed a little light on the man that you call the Oddest Inkling, Charles Williams. Now, looking through Carpenter's book and through Tolkien's own letters, it seems that the phrase, "it's complicated," fits the way that Tolkien viewed his relationship with Charles Williams. Can you start by telling us a bit about the early years of their friendship before we talk about how Tolkien's views would later change?
Sure. Yes, that's a very good question. And I think you could say it's complicated about most things related to Charles Williams, whether his writings or his life. However, it wasn't all that complicated at first. Charles Williams was a Londoner, born and raised in London, but in 1939, he was evacuated out of London to Oxford because of the bombings. He had recently, 3 years before, in 1936, begun corresponding with C.S. Lewis and had sometimes come up to Oxford to meet with the Inklings. We think that he met Tolkien on Monday, May 18th, 1936, somewhere around there.
That's very specific.
But we're not totally sure. We know that Tolkien and Lewis met with some new member of the Inklings that day, and so we suspect that it was Williams. But it was around there anyway, spring of 1936. So he would have visited the Inklings a few times until he moved there in 39. And then he was a regular member about twice a week for the next 6 years until he died quite unexpectedly in 1945. So during those 6 years, it seems that Tolkien and Williams were very good friends. They write back and forth to their family members about how pleasant it is to see one another. Tolkien always looks forward to when he's able to make it to an Inklings. He calls it a great event. And it's not only in the Inklings settings that he and Williams meet up. They'll sometimes grab dinner or a drink, just the two of them. And there's one particular evening that after the Inklings, they leave Lewis's rooms at Magdalen at midnight, and just the two of them go walking for quite some time, and they talk about the concept of freedom and the different ways the concept of freedom is used. And this is in the fall of 1944. So the idea of freedom is very much on everyone's minds.
Understandably.
Yes. And they read each other's works. Tolkien doesn't really get Williams's works very much, but let me read you an important line from one of Tolkien's letters. He writes, "C. Williams, who was reading it all," and by it all, he means all of the Lord of the Rings that is written up to this date, Christmas Eve, 1944. So C. Williams, who is reading it all, says the great thing is that its center is not in strife and war and heroism, though they are understood and depicted, but in freedom, peace, ordinary life, and good living. So Williams had this skill that he could sort of grasp the overall picture of something very quickly. He wrote a lot of biographies of historical personages. He wrote literary criticism about historical periods in literature. And he would get this kind of gestalt. He would sort of see what it's all about at once. And I'd say he got the heart of Lord of the Rings in that glimpse.
Based on that, absolutely.
Yeah. So Williams was a fan of Tolkien's writing, and Tolkien records many occasions on which he'll read a chapter in progress, and it's very important to him to note when Lewis and Williams approved. He uses that word several times, approved. That's sort of when he knows he's got a chapter right.
That'd
So
be a
it
good
seems that they
measurement.
had a very healthy friendship and a mutual admiration, and they
Yeah.
had inside jokes, and they enjoyed spending time together.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and in fact, during those early years, Tolkien actually wrote a really lengthy poem. I know you know more about it than I do, about Charles Williams. That alone, that poem's got to be an hour or two long conversation in itself. But could you maybe give us a few of your favorite lines and talk us a little bit about them?
Sure, thank you. It's known as Our Dear Charles Williams, but the actual title is A Closed Letter to Andrea Chericorides, surnamed Polygraphius, logothete of the theme of Geodesia in the Empire, bard of the court of Camelot, Malleus Malletarium, Inklingasum, sometimes known as Charles Williams.
Oh my goodness, that is
Now,
a
do I have any time
mouthful.
left to read any lines?
Yeah, I guess you do. I'll give it to you anyway. Wow, that's something else.
And this was written in November of 1943.
Okay.
And he calls him Our Dear Charles Williams. And he
Yeah,
writes
yeah.
about the fact that Williams is a novelist and a poet. He does write about his work being difficult. I love these lines. I find his prose obscure at times. Yeah, me too, dude. Not easily it flows. Too often are his lights held up in brackets. And like literally, Williams will be
Yeah.
writing along and he'll put something important in parentheses, like in brackets, and it will slow the
Yeah.
pace. But he goes on to say that what he admires about Williams is the way that he can expose evil, but also write about goodness.
Hmm.
Heavenly footsteps too can Williams trace, and after Dante, plunging, soaring, race up to the threshold of eternal grace.
Hmm.
And Williams had not yet published his study of Dante then, so I suspect what
Okay.
Tolkien is remembering there is conversations. I'm guessing
Yeah.
that it was when they were discussing things that Williams would sort of speak in this high-flown rhetoric and make everyone feel like they got a sense of heaven when they were conversing.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's something.
It's
Now,
beautiful.
the thing is, though, in later years, after Williams did unexpectedly die in 1945, it would eventually become evident that Tolkien's admiration and fondness for Williams kind of changed. Was there anything in particular that you think might have triggered that?
Yes, and if you don't know about what triggered it, it seems very surprising that in
Okay.
1944, Tolkien will write, "I knew Williams very well," and then in 63 he'll write, "I never knew him well."
Ooh.
And in 44 he'll write,
Ooh.
"I was good friends with Williams," and in 63 he'll write, "Oh, we weren't friends, we just both knew Jack Lewis."
Hmm.
So what's the difference here? And then
Yeah.
in
What
in the
changed?
40s we'll have that late night conversation, and in the
Yeah.
60s we'll say we never had anything to say to each other on a deeper level.
Wow. And
So
yet he was already gone, so it wasn't
he was
something
gone.
that Williams did while he was still alive. It wasn't like a fight that the two of them
Right.
had. It was something that
Mhm.
Tolkien kind of maybe on reflection thought
Yes, it was
differently?
18 years later. So
Wow.
two big things happened in that interval.
Mhm.
One is that C.S. Lewis died.
Yeah.
And I think Tolkien's much deeper grief for Lewis, because they had been friends for
Yeah.
decades, I think that made him go back and realize, you know what? I lost Jack Lewis many times. I lost him when he died,
Mm.
but I'd already lost him with his very strange marriage, in Tolkien's mind, to
Yeah.
Joy Davidman. And really, in a way, I'd lost him before that when Charles Williams came sweeping in and became
Mm.
Lewis's best male friend.
Yeah.
So I've heard people say, oh, Tolkien was jealous of Williams and Lewis's friendship. My answer now, after looking at the evidence, is not at the time. Not
No.
at the time. Only on reflection when he looked back and
That's
said, oh,
interesting.
that's when I started losing
Yeah.
Lewis. But
Huh.
something else happened too, a little earlier. In 1958 and 1959, biographical material about Williams was published.
Okay.
And we are reasonably certain that Tolkien read that.
Mhm.
And so he learned things about his friend that made him say, oh, I didn't really know that man. And he was hiding a
Oh,
lot from
okay.
me.
Well, I
So
do remember from our conversation way back in, I think that was season 3 of the PPP
think
when we
so.
first talked about it. He did have some unusual, shall we say, interests that
He
I can imagine
did.
did conflict with Tolkien's.
Yep. And what would have disturbed Tolkien the most was finding out that Williams was a member of a secret society called the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross. Now,
Okay.
this group, and again, we go into it in more detail in episode 102 there,
Yeah.
but this group called itself a mystical society. but scholars tend to call it an occult society, and its rituals were very much dancing on that border between mysticism and magic. And whether it is reconcilable with the Roman Catholic faith or not, Tolkien would not have thought so.
Well, right. That's the thing. I mean, somebody else might reconcile it, but Tolkien wasn't going to be able to reconcile it.
Yes. No. I mean, the founder of the group was also a communing Roman Catholic and did not think that there was any contradiction there. But Tolkien definitely would not have approved of...
A little bit more of a traditionalist. I mean, I remember seeing some of his letters where he, lamented the fact that the priest delivered the mass in English instead of Latin.
Right. And here he finds out that his friend was practicing astrology and reading the tarot cards and practicing these rituals to banish evil spirits and things like that.
Remembering the letter he wrote to Lewis when he found out that Lewis was going to marry a divorced woman, I can just imagine his words had he been able to write a letter to Charles Williams. I wonder if that must have been a little frustrating. Like, I'd like to talk to you about this, Charles, but you're dead and I can't. Yeah.
Well, that reminds me of C.S. Lewis's beautiful sonnet on the death of Charles Williams. He talks about how he misses him and he misses sharing jokes. Yeah. And the poem ends, "This is a question, your death. This is a question I want to sit up talking all night about, but with whom except you."
Oh, man. Yeah.
And so I wondered whether the other thing that would have really concerned Tolkien would have been Williams's private life, because Williams carried on a very, very long-term, I guess you could say, emotional affair with a woman besides his wife. There are only the merest hints of that in this material. All of his friends pretty much kept that under wraps until Williams's wife passed away, and then they wrote about it. But there are little hints. Like one of the biographers says, at his workplace, Williams saw a second image of romantic theology. Like that's only a hint, but Tolkien was a very good reader. He may have picked up on it.
Very skilled at picking up and reading between the lines. And
and then he may have gone back and reread Williams's poetry and seen this stuff about a second image, meaning a second person you fall in love with.
Right.
And then may have seen some of the things in the poetry about, frankly, about men mistreating women, and then may have wondered, was this anything that Williams was actually involved in his real life? So I think he felt betrayed. I thought I knew you, Charles, and I didn't.
That's a pretty big hit, especially when you can't reconcile that. You can't come to the person and say, "Hey, I thought I knew you. Let's talk about this." Yeah. Instead, you're stuck with, "This is the knowledge I have, and I can't." There's nothing. You can't clarify anything. You can't explain anything. You can't try to square things up or apologize or anything.
And then in your grief, you start rewriting the past, and you start rereading what your friend has left. And so in Tolkien's
different
started saying, "I never really knew him. We were only passing acquaintances. He didn't influence me." He may have gotten a little, maybe scared is too strong a word, but a little bit like, "Wow, I wouldn't want anybody to think we were too close now that I'm learning these things that I
a little bit of I don't want to be guilty by association sort of thing."
Right.
Yeah. My goodness.
And he even goes so far as to say, "Oh, Williams never read anything of mine." Wait a minute. We just talked about how Williams read everything and saw into the heart of it immediately.
Yeah, it's true. And he really did. I mean, you're right. That insight that you gave, when Williams responded what was at the heart of the Lord of the Rings, it's clear not only did he read it, he understood it and, got the big picture.
And it wasn't even finished. He didn't even get to read The Scouring of the Shire. He died in 45. Yeah.
That's right. Oh my goodness. Yeah. That is rough. You mentioned C.S. Lewis, and obviously part of, like you said, was he jealous? Not at the time, but could you talk to us a bit more about the dynamics at work in that relationship between the three of them while Williams was still alive, and obviously while Lewis was before 63, between Tolkien, Williams, and C.S. Lewis?
Yes, I could. And if you don't mind, I'd love to make it 4, because I think Warnie Lewis was just as important.
That's true. It's easy to forget how important he was. Yeah,
I know, because he seems like he was more of a quiet character than his brother. And yet there are those who say the Inklings never would have happened without Warnie's hospitality. That he was really the host of the group, even though Jack was the more sparkling character.
He was the life of the party. Yeah.
Yeah, but there wouldn't have been a party without Warnie welcoming people in and making sure everyone was comfortable. And we see this in Tolkien's letters when he basically says, "I got to hang out with the Lewis brothers and CW," and looks forward to it. Can I read a hilarious passage from a letter from this time?
Humor is always welcome here. Yeah.
it just shows kind of like what the spirit of their meetings was. Mm-hmm. So this is November 24th, 1944, and Tolkien is raving about a great event, an evening Inklings. And he says he got to the Mitre pub at 8 o'clock, where he was joined by CW and the Red Admiral. That is Humphrey Havard, also known as the Useless Quack, the man of many nicknames.
We actually did a Tolkien Tuesday on him. He's got many nicknames, yes.
He must have been a fun character, too.
Interesting fellow.
And they resolved to take fuel on board before joining the well-oiled diners in Maudlin, CSL and Owen Barfield, who are well-oiled by that time.
Yes.
CSL was highly flown. Probably the oiling helped.
Of course.
But we were also in good fettle, while OB, Owen Barfield, is the only man who can tackle CSL, making him define everything and interrupting his most dogmatic pronouncements with subtle distinguos. So you can kind of see how Jack is like, he's sort of going on and on about something.
He's pontificating about something.
Yeah. And then Barfield, who was smaller and very agile mentally and physically, would be like, now, wait a minute. This and that. Yep. And by the way, this is only one of 2 documented occasions when we know for sure that Charles Williams and Owen Barfield met in person.
Oh, okay.
So Tolkien goes on. He says, the result was a most amusing and highly contentious evening on which, had an outsider eavesdropped, he would have thought it a meeting of fell enemies hurling deadly insults before drawing their guns. Like the best kind of debating. Warney was an excellent majoral form, Warney being a lifelong military man.
Yeah.
On one occasion, when the audience had flatly refused to hear Jack discourse on and define chance, Jack said, very well, some other time, but if you die tonight, you'll be cut off knowing a great deal less about chance than you might have. Warney, that only illustrates what I've always said. Every cloud has a silver lining. Burn.
Wow.
So you get there.
Aloe vera for that. Yeah.
Oh, seriously. So you get there Tolkien's writing skill in capturing the mood. Yeah. And you get Warney and Jack brothers, dueling wits and personalities. And Williams and Barfield and Havard are part of this whole thing that they're all in fine fettle and they're all debating so that it kind of looks like a meeting of enemies, but they love each other.
Right. Oh, yeah. That's good stuff. Thank you for that. That was a really illustrative letter. I appreciate you sharing that
letter. Thanks.
I wish we had more time, but Sørina, thank you again for joining us today on today's Tolkien Times. It was a real pleasure to visit with you.
Glad to give you a taste of this anytime, Alan.
Absolutely. Well, folks, that is it for today's Fandom Friday, but come back next Friday to meet another of your fellow Tolkien fans and maybe even learn what niches of the community you might be interested in exploring. And if you're interested in joining me here for a future Fandom Friday, let me know by emailing barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout with me, a bonus weekly episode, and a lot more. And then join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times as we wrap up this week with Second Age Saturday. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.